Hey everybody, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using the Mandala Bouquet as well as the Happy Expressions stamp set and die set, both by Spellbinders. We're going to be making two pretty quick and simple cards involving Copic coloring, but getting a little bit more out of your Copic coloring. So I'm going to start off here with a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I'm placing my large stamp here right in my MISTI, just so that I am able to stamp this twice later. First, I'm going to be stamping with Blackout ink by Ink on 3, and I'm not worried about getting a perfect impression here because we're going to heat emboss this. But I've always heard that you're not supposed to Copic color over embossing after you've already heat embossed. So we're going to do this afterwards. So I'm going to keep my stamp right inside my MISTI for later, but we're going to move on to the Copic coloring, and I'm going to speed this up a little bit, but it's pretty simple. I really stuck to simple Copic coloring here, but I'm going to be using 3 different combinations of greens, and I'm just going to show you the 3 combinations basically. For these middle leaves, I'm doing my shading all the same. I'm just going to be adding a little bit of shading to the base of each of these leaves with the darkest color. I first started with my lightest color just to get the paper saturated just a little bit. This makes the blending a little bit easier. Next, I'm going to extend that out with my darkest mid-tone, and I'm just putting one straight line right there in the center where that vein of the leaf is. Next, I'll move on to the lightest mid-tone and extend that area out even further, and I'm just leaving a very small highlight right on the tip of the leaf for my lightest color, and I'll go back in with that lightest color just to fill in that highlight area. For the next set of leaves, I'm just going to move on. I'm kind of working my way out to the end of my little circle here. I'm going to be using a different color combination, but also YG markers. And I'm going to be doing pretty much the same thing. Now, some of these, or these leaves, are the base of them, sorry, couldn't think of the word, is solid, is black. So there's not really going to be a whole lot of shading that's necessary here. You wouldn't even necessarily need to use 4 colors. Because we're going to be heat embossing this later, you don't need to have all that much shading as long as you have some kind of contrast to make your images pop out a little bit. So again, doing the same thing, just adding a little bit of shading to the base. This time I'm skipping that line right through the center. I'm just adding that shading, keeping my highlight right on the tip of the leaf. And for the outside leaves, I'm going to be using a different combination, and I'm only going to show you some of these. I'm not going to show you all of them. They took a little bit of time, more time than you guys want to see, but not too bad. So I'm just going to show you a few of them here. So like always, I'm going to start off with my lightest color to map out my darkest areas. Now these leaves are different shapes. They're not just straight leaves. So I'm just paying attention to the shape of the leaf to determine where I'm going to put my shading. If they're just straight like the other ones, I'm putting my shading right there on the base of it, kind of working my way up towards the middle. But the one is kind of tilted to the side, and so I'm putting a little bit more shading on the side that it's tilted against. Then the other one looks like it's kind of bent a little bit, so I'm putting more shading. My shading, all of my shading, is going to be just on the one side of the leaf. I went in with my darkest color to go over those same areas that we had mapped out. Some of these leaves are very tiny, so you're just going to want to barely touch the paper with just the tip of your marker. Going to extend that out with my darkest mid-tone and then my lightest mid-tone, making sure that I do leave a very small highlight on each one of the leaves. Even if it's teeny tiny, it will make a huge difference to have that highlight color. So I went ahead and colored all of the outside leaves pretty much the same way based on the shape of the leaf. And then I'm going to go ahead and heat emboss this now. So I'm going to place this back in my MISTI in the same position as I did before. I'm going to treat my panel with my anti-static tool, and then I'm going to switch over to VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And I'm just making sure my stamp is really inked up well. And the beauty of the MISTI is not only for techniques like this, is but you can also stamp it twice if you don't get a great impression. And being I'd already stamped with black ink, it was hard to see if I got a good impression, so I just stamped it a second time just to make sure. Next, I'll go ahead and sprinkle on some clear embossing powder, and this is the Detail clear embossing powder, and this is by Simon Says Stamp. For an image like this, it's probably best to use the Detail embossing powder, especially to get those little veins within the leaves. Any kind of other embossing powder may leave it a little bit too chunky. So I went ahead and heat up my heat gun prior to bringing that to the paper and heat set all of that. Now this is a large image, so even though my heat gun was preheated, it did warp my paper a little bit. And this is where I noticed that I definitely stamped not so much in the center. So I had to trim a little bit off the right hand side, and just to make my panel even, I took a little bit off the top as well. And I'm going to go ahead and die cut out of Nina Solar White both the outline and the shadow part of the happy. And I wasn't sure which color I wanted what to be, so I die cut them both in white, and I can just color it whatever color I want it to be. So I placed that where I wanted the happy to be. I wasn't sure if I was going to have it right over my image or right below it. I decided that I didn't want it directly over it. It was going to cover way too much of it. So I ended up taking the shadow piece, and I'm using one of the greens that I used for the leaves, and I'm just going to color that in solid. I'm not doing any kind of shading or anything like that, but this will match my leaves nicely, and I don't have to pull out any colored cardstock. Like I've said before, I very rarely use colored cardstock. I just create my own. So I took my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere my word down to that shadow piece. And I know a lot of you guys have said that you've had problems with Tombow Mono Multi Glue because it kind of leaves a residue. As long as you just use a teeny tiny bit, I don't seem to have a problem. If any does squeeze out of the side, I just wipe it up with my finger, and usually I don't have any residue left behind. If you ever do, just let it dry and use a adhesive eraser, and you should have no problem. So I went ahead and took that same glue to adhere that entire piece directly below my image there. And I'm going to be using 2 of the sentiments from the stamp set that comes in this die set as well. And I'm going to take out a piece of black cardstock, and I'm going to treat that with my anti-static tool and stamp both of those sentiments right there on the bottom part. I'm going to cut these into 2 separate strips. This will be a sentiment on the top of that happy and on the bottom of the happy. So I just want to make sure that it's lined up the best I can, so that way I only have to run this through or use my paper trimmer just one time. Like I've told you guys before, I don't like to measure, and I'm not all that great with cutting a straight line. So I sprinkled on some white embossing powder this time, and went ahead and heat set that. Again, making sure that my heat gun is heated up before bringing that to the paper. And you'll see that one of my letters on that second part of the sentiment I didn't get a great impression when I stamped it. I think my Versamark is starting to dry up a little bit. So I'll fix that in a minute once I notice it. I'm just cutting this into small strips and kind of getting the size right to make it look okay around that happy. The first time I cut it, it was just a little bit too long, that bottom one. So I did take my scissors, and believe it or not, successfully, it was able to cut a straight line. And I just took my white gel pen to fix that little letter, and you'll never know the difference. So I took that same Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere my panel down onto a black A2 size note card, just to give a little bit of a black border around that panel, being we had to cut that down because I can't center anything. And then I took some Scotch foam tape and went ahead and cut those down into skinny little strips for the back of my little sentiment strips, line those up, pop those down, and that is the first card using this stamp set, and we'll jump right into the second card. For this one, I'm going to be using some Nina Desert Storm cardstock, and there's Frankie. This is smoother than regular craft, so you can color on it with your Copics. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp the other image in the stamp set with my Blackout ink by Ink on 3. And I wasn't sure which direction I was going to want this, but I ultimately flipped that around. And we're going to jump right into the coloring, and I have this sped up a lot. It did not take that long, but this video is already pretty long to begin with, so I didn't want to totally bore you guys. But just so that you can see where I'm putting the shading, because there's a lot of intricate areas within these flowers. So not only to saturate my paper do I go in with the lightest color, but I also map out my shadow areas in case I mess up, because I can easily cover the lightest color. I can't necessarily cover the darkest color. So it's easier to go in with that lightest color just to map those areas out, especially for an image like this. I am concentrating my shading on the base of each of the petals, as well as where one petal is laying behind another. There's a lot of curvy petals on these images as well. So if any of the petals are kind of folded over on themselves, I also created a shadow with that. I am using a 4-color blend here, and when you're coloring on the Nina Desert Storm cardstock, you want to kind of go with darker colors than maybe you want your image to be, because it is going to be a little bit muted because it's more of a craft cardstock. So my lightest color is not necessarily a color I would use for my highlight, but in this case, that's the lightest I'm going to go, because anything else is probably not even going to show up. For the center of this flower, this is a round object, so I'm just adding shading on the top and the bottom around that little circle. Jumping right into the next flower here. This is pretty much the same. It's shaped slightly different, but I am using the same color combination, and I'll show you the entire thing just so that you can see where I put my shading. This type of image can get a little confusing, especially for the center of the flower. The petals get, the petals get a little bit smaller, and each one of them are kind of bent over on themselves, which makes the area even smaller yet. So going in with my darkest color, creating all of my shadows for my larger petals, and you'll see when I get to the center of the flower, I'm not necessarily putting my darkest color in every single area. You don't have to do all of your shading with your darkest color. You can do your shading with your darkest midtone, and for really teeny tiny areas, you can even do your shading with your lightest midtone. And you'll see that some of those petals, that's what I did, especially where they were folded over on themselves. I didn't necessarily need to go in with the very darkest color, or else the entire petal would end up dark. There just wasn't enough room to fit all 4 colors, or some of them even 3 colors. So going in with my darkest midtone and then my lightest midtone and extending all of those areas out. Where the petals are folded over on themselves, I didn't do any shading at all on the fold part. I'm just leaving that whole area for my highlight color. You do want to move kind of quickly with the lightest color, because this isn't typically a cardstock that you'd color Copic color on. You want to kind of avoid any bleeding, so you want to go in pretty quickly. You don't want to overblend here. Next, moving on to the first set of leaves, I'm going to be using the same color combination for both leaves here, but just concentrating my shading. These leaves are laying underneath the flowers, so there's going to be a shadow there, and also a shadow where some of them are folded over on themselves. And then I'm just adding a little bit of shading in the center of each of the leaves. Going in with the midtone and extending all of those areas out. Same thing with the lightest midtone, and just leaving the sides and the tip of the leaves for my highlight color. Next, we'll move on to the second set of leaves here using the same color combination, and these are shaped a little bit differently. They kind of look like they have folds in them. So I'm going to go right in with my darkest color. Because these are pretty tiny, I'm going to skip my darkest midtone because I want there to be enough contrast. I'm only going to be using 3 colors here, and just extending those lines out a little bit further and leaving a majority of the petal, or not the petals, the leaves or the sections of the leaves for my highlight color. This will give it a lot of contrast. So once my coloring was all done, I am going to be using the largest patched layer die by Waffle Flower. And this doesn't actually cut out a rectangle for you. it just gives you some, I don't want to say texture, but it gives you some, you have to cut your cardstock to the size that you want it, if that makes any sense, but it will give you like a little stitching around it. I can't speak. You guys know what I mean. So I'm also going to take that same Nina Desert Storm to cut out my word and the shadow for the word. Again, wasn't entirely sure what color I wanted to have my words, so I just cut it out of the paper that I used, and I'll decide that later. Place that onto my cardstock, and I kind of liked the tone on tone look, so I kept it that way. So I adhered my word to that shadow again with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. You can use a fine tip, you can squeeze this into a fine tip bottle if that works better for you. But if you barely squeeze the bottle, only a tiny dot is going to come out, and then I kind of use the nozzle to spread that around to avoid any of that kind of gooping out the side. Place that down onto my card panel to determine where I wanted to stamp the rest of my sentiment. And I'm going to be using black dye ink by Simon Says Stamp. And I started off, this was going to be a birthday card, but then I remembered that there's a whole bunch of words in this stamp set that you can kind of mix and match, and I changed my mind. So I ended up choosing a different sentiment and stamped that right underneath my little flowers or my little bouquet there, and then I will adhere my happy directly underneath that with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. Again, just positioning that or just putting enough glue so that it doesn't squeeze out the sides. And that is it. Those are the 2 cards for today. Thank you guys a lot for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.